been thinking a lot about words and the power of language, and how the words that go into creating the technologies that we use for education and for learning matter at a very metacognitive level beyond the coding. In The Nature of Creativity, Mumford and colleagues point to how pre-existing knowledge and values can cloud judgment in the very construction of the problem being studied.
In her book, Sente Pensante Pedagogy, Laura Rendon asks us to reject the monocultural framework and seek learning design that values the individual's quest for knowledge and the importance of dialogue in the shared construction of meaning and practice. When creating educational technology, how might we ensure the values embedded within the design are not harmful? In his book, Education and Technology, Neil Selwyn emphasizes that the research points to learning as being profoundly a social process, and our technology for learning serves as cultural tools for human action, with emphasis on co-construction. In his piece, Our Bodies Encoded, Shea Swager prompts us to ask what values are embedded in technology tools that institutions and educational systems force us to use and consider the harm. Settler colonialism in the literature, including by Professor Kyle Powers-White at Michigan State, is framed as a distinct type of colonialism that functions through the replacement of indigenous populations with a settler society that over time develops a distinct identity and sovereignty and seeks to erase the moral and complex ecosystem of indigenous philosophies, culture, and language.
I decided to focus on an educational tool that has been used to propagate the Spanish language in Latin America and apply a critical speculative design lens to reimagine what that tool could look like if it had been designed to revitalize dormant indigenous languages.
In El Salvador, or Cuscatlan, as it's known in the Pipil language. In El Salvador, settler colonialism and the repression of indigenous languages has been pervasive. In 1932, a genocide was carried out in which approximately 30,000 indigenous peoples died, and those who spoke their indigenous language, wore their indigenous attire, and lived their own indigenous ways of life were persecuted.
In terms of language justice, when we talk about equity in language expression and articulation, it's about having a sense of dignity to express yourself in the language that feels the most authentic to you. And that's not always possible in spaces where there is a dominant language required. And even when there is accommodation, it's not always in a equitable parity to the dominant language. And then in cases of indigenous languages that have gone dormant, we don't have the tools. We don't have sometimes the ancestral knowledge in order to revitalize or recuperate that fluency in the language. So there is some suffering and loss that needs to be recognized in that.
Advancing language justice is about uplifting new ways of knowing and honoring ancestral knowledge in the new technology we create. Linguist Alan King's research work and activism towards revitalizing indigenous languages has included much work with indigenous languages of El Salvador. Through deep analysis of texts and primary records available, he and his colleagues reconstructed a foundational understanding of the language structure, syntax, lexicon, and phonology of Lenca, Putum, and other languages. In his guide, Lenca for Linguists, he points out that most of the primary records available were written by non-native speakers of the language, and we may be fairly certain that the collectors of the data did not know or understand Lenca fluently, so they could only record what they thought they heard. The linguistic elements may be taken as missing the insight of fluent speakers. Alan King's linguistic analysis also sheds light on the nomenclature itself being Hispanicized. He proposes calling the Lenca dialect of El Salvador Sai Putum and the dialect of Honduras Soror y Putum. This edition of El Silabario Hispanoamericano was published in 2006. It contains stereotypical caricatures and lacks diverse representation. The earliest one I found online was published in 1861 in Puerto Rico. It propagated not only the language but also Christianity. It includes biblical references and exalts the arrival of Christopher Columbus.
Finally feeling ready to start the painting process. But first, coffee.
And here's one of the finished pieces. It depicts words in Nahuatl, one of the indigenous languages of El Salvador that is still spoken and being revitalized, as well as English and Spanish. With this piece, I am creating a digital interactive image that will feature the words depicted, based on a Lincoln dictionary of several hundred words, reconstructed by Alan King's linguistic analysis. Important to note, his work has shed light on the nomenclature itself. He proposes calling the Lincoln dialect of El Salvador using Lincoln words instead of Hispanicized terms. He proposes we call the Lincoln dialect of Honduras Soror y Putum, which means language of the wind, and the dialect of El Salvador Sai y Putum, which means language of the ocean. It is the language of my ancestors.